So this week we're going to go a little deeper into the view construction, talk about different pieces of the view and how it's built. We're going to get into using what are called HTML handlers and Lambda expressions to build out and utilize those handlers. Basically what they're there for is to help us utilize these strongly typed view models, or views and view models, and build out our controls in a way that doesn't require us to write a whole bunch of HTML markup and allows us to stay in sync when we choose to change our models. So as we make changes to our classes, maybe we rename a property or something to that effect, we don't have to go back and scrape and say where are all these existences. We can just say make the change, we can use the refactor functionality within Visual Studio, and we get out what we are expecting with name changes and everything happening throughout the entire project. So that's a broad stroke statement. Probably doesn't mean a whole lot to you right now, but we'll get into the details of that. At the same time, I want to touch a little bit on the pieces. I know we've touched on it before, but we'll go over it again about how you have the view that's aligned with the action. But I also want to talk again about that layout component to your website and how that comes into play. And as we go through and build a couple of these views and actions today, specifically around logging in and creating an account, we'll go through those mechanics a little bit and talk about how do you add a login button to your website, how do you do these types of things. All right? So as a quick refresh, I'm just going to launch our app and we can kind of take a look at what we ended with last week. So what we did is we built out an account controller. We started building out an account controller. We created a login action. And inside of that we have something, maybe. We should have a login page. And we were just kind of playing around with putting in some generic information and seeing it come back to our action on the post back, and then we basically just dump it out to the screen. So there's our post back. We have our view model parameter in here, and then that turns around and gives us back username, password, and then our always login set to true. So getting that data back. And then we just went through the process of dumping it back out on the screen as a string, nothing fancy, and there we are. Okay? So let's kind of kick this piece of it up a notch. Let's get rid of some of that HTML markup and let's just replace it with these HTML helpers. Now the helpers don't do really anything for you on the controller side. It's on the view side where they're useful. Now, one of the things, and I'll touch on this a little bit more later, is you have a lot of these different style sheet frameworks or design frameworks that you can use for your website designs. The ASP.NET projects, if you're using the Internet project, it comes defaulted with jQuery as the JavaScript library that they recommend. Microsoft actually contributes to the jQuery library fairly extensively, providing enhancements and changes to it. The second one that they recommend and kind of bake into the default project is Bootstrap. And Bootstrap is primarily a CSS or style sheet design framework that was actually developed by Twitter. And that's what they use on Twitter is Bootstrap, and then it's publicly available as a framework that you can download and incorporate into your websites. And they're really just there to make your sites look pretty, not feel like flat, static pages, but have some design to them. And a lot of the content templates or page templates that you'll see get pre-generated utilize Bootstrap. So if you're interested in more about Bootstrap, you can go to getbootstrap.com, and there's some tutorials and CSS references and stuff. And basically what it boils down to is in your CSS files, you have these classes that you make when you define your styles. You're like dot, whatever the class name is for your style sheet. it's a library of those predefined, pre-created, color schemes are all set, and then you simply go through and you start decorating your elements with these classes, with these style classes. And it turns around and renders out on your page, and you get a nice, pretty looking page instead of something that's blah and simplistic from, you know, the 90s. So that's the idea behind these frameworks. There's a lot of different ones out there. Bootstrap is just one of them. Honestly, it works fairly well. I use it most of the time. Occasionally I go through and try to find different deviations or versions of the Bootstrap framework with different colors, but that's what you stick with typically if you're staying in that realm. And again, there's other different ones, so we're going to play with that a little bit and talk about how do you kind of enhance the look and feel of your site through that. All right, so to start off, we have this form. What I'm going to do is I want to replace all of my text boxes with HTML helpers. So right here I have a label, username, and that's fine. We'll keep that there. Then I'm going to do @html.textbox4. And what that is it's a function. HTML is actually a property that is part of your view. So think of your view kind of like a class at this point, and it actually inherits from a base view class, and it brings along this property HTML. So you do HTML dot, and then you have all these different functions. You have textbox, textbox4, toString, validate, validate4, validation message. We go back up higher. We have things like ID, ID4, label, label4, listbox, name, partials, password 4, radio button 4, and the list goes on and on. There's a fairly good breadth of controls, input form controls and some labels that are pre-built into this HTML helper is what it's called. It's there to help you write HTML faster without actually having to write it. One of the things that's actually really nice about the way that they implemented this is that you can write your own HTML helpers as well. So if you have a particular style, or if there's a particular way that you want your HTML to render out, you can write your own helpers. And then you pass in your parameters, and then it'll render out HTML. So if you want to have custom styling, but you want to be consistent, you write your own helpers, and then you utilize those throughout the project. I actually did that for one of the last projects I did, and it works well. It takes a little bit of a learning curve, just like anything else, to learn how to write a good helper, but once you write it, you know, you're writing 1 or 2 lines of code instead of writing 5 or 6 lines of HTML, and then if you have to do it over and over again, it really becomes a time save. So this is probably one of the first places of extension you may want to consider if you go down the path of building a complex app, is looking at building custom helpers, because it'll save you time and gives you more flexibility around the HTML that gets rendered out, especially when you start talking about things like style libraries and things to that effect. All right, so I'm going to use I'm going to use textbox4 in this case. And what textbox4, if you look at the IntelliSense pop-up, it's going to tell you that it wants things like a T model of a T property, and it's looking for a link expression that's a function that takes in T model and returns T takes in T model, returns T property, and there's dictionaries of string object values for HTML attributes, and there's 5 overloads. Very fancy. Lots of cool things. Don't worry about any of that. The most simplistic way that you utilize this is you call it as a function. So textbox4, open parenthesis. And then what it's looking for is a lambda expression. Now, if you took class with me in a previous term, we've covered briefly lambda expressions. They basically look like these tiny expressions with an arrow. And what they are is that they are functions written in extreme shorthand. So the X on the left-hand side of the arrow is your parameter. And you're identifying what the name of that parameter is. Let me zoom in. So in my case, my parameter that I want to use inside of my function is called x. Sometimes I write it this way. Right, because your parameters are in parentheses, so you have the name of the function, parentheses, whatever parameters are getting passed into that function. Well, this is called a lambda expression, or an anonymous function is sometimes what it's referred to. So the function has no name, and it only exists within the context of this line of code. But what it's doing is it's taking in x, and x right now we don't know what it is, and then it's saying I'm going to take x and I'm going to do something with it on the right-hand side of the arrow. And in this case, what's happening is that x is being passed in, and I'll tell you what x is in a moment, and then it's taking from x and it's grabbing the username property. X is an instance of our view model. So what's being passed into this function, that is x, is our view model. Now sometimes it's noted like this. And you'll see this in examples. They'll say model, lowercase. And you'll notice when I change that to model, the x on the right-hand side gets a red squiggle because x no longer exists. It's now model. So what is this code doing? What it's doing is it's saying, create a text box for the username property that comes as part of the model. And if the model object that gets passed in from our controller, which in our case we don't have that, here. So this is that call for that view. We can actually pass an object in here, which then turns around and becomes the object that is our model on the other side. So we have this model. We're grabbing that username property, and we're telling it to generate a text box for username. And all that that's going to do for us is it's going to generate that input tag that we had there before. And it's going to give it a name of username. It's going to actually give it an ID of username. And within MVC, they've got some additional markup that they include for text validation and things like that. Perfectly legitimate HTML, and it is HTML. And they just choose to use it. If you think it's too verbose, write your own HTML handler. So if we run this with just one change, yeah.
Can you like add attributes then to the text box, like when I have an ID or anything for it?
Yes, and I'll do that in a moment. I want to run this first, and then we'll look at how we can expand it. So I'm going to make this change, save, go back to the browser, go back one, and then do a full refresh. And there it is. Hopefully some of you are looking at it like it looks the same, and that's the point. It should look the same. So if we right click and we inspect element on here, hang on, I don't know if it took. So here we have input ID equals username, name, username, type text, value, undefined. There's no value because it's empty. Now if you compare that to the one that I hand coded last week, it says input type equals password, name equals password. So this was one where I did not give it an ID. Part of the markup that gets generated includes that ID field. So ASP.NET MVC did that for me. So if I flip back to my code, let's replace this one. So I'll do HTML dot, and this is password for, because I want a password box. And I like to use X just because it's short and I don't have to type the word model out. X.password. I don't need all the extra parentheses. I don't need to do all those things. it'll work simply by doing X, and then what I refer to as the arrow, equal sign, and a less than symbol, and then X dot in the property name. So that generates that property for me. So make that change, I'll hit save. Flip back, refresh. And it looks the same. If I flip to my HTML view, we'll now see that the markup has changed. Not substantially, but we now have that ID field or password. So the helper is there to eliminate us having to write the code. If we go in and decide that we're going to change our model, or I'm sorry, our view model, and maybe I don't want to call it password. I don't know why I wouldn't, but let's say I didn't. I wanted to call it the P word. I can use the refactor functionality within Visual Studio and do a rename. It didn't pick it up. So I made the refactor here. I'm not sure why it didn't pick it up here, but it did identify that it was no longer valid. Visual Studio picked that up. I'm not sure why it doesn't refactor. But from here, we can still get IntelliSense, and we can make the adjustment by hand. So now it sees it as P word. We can make that save change, recompile, and let me rerun it. So now just looking at that markup, everything now says for the name and ID is now P word. So that was one change I had to make in the view instead of two, and then think about the potential of having to do it over and over. And now these are overly simplistic, implementations. Text box isn't fancy. Drop-down lists can become complex, but there's a helper for that. All right, so let's say that we wanted to add some additional styling to it.